Hi! So, I want to do it. I want to finally take the plunge and learn geometry nodes. Geometry nodes! My plan is to watch tutorials and follow courses, plus seeing what other people have made and like what I can learn from their node tree setups. And then I want to make grease pencil artworks that use geometry nodes in increasingly complex ways as I learn more about this system. So my goal for this first piece, the most straightforward piece, is to make a plane of flickering, glowing grease pencil stars, and then to have that turn into a rotating sphere of the same stars. I have a character who was very into astronomy as a kid and still is as an adult, and I want to show how her mapping of stars and constellations went from like 2D drawings to computerized 3D models. I really love how this piece came out. I think it's a sweet piece about following the passions that we had as kids and how these same passions can mature alongside us. Very cute. So my initial goals regarding geometry nodes are to prepare the flickering grease pencil stars, to animate them onto a square, like a flat plane, and then turn that square into a sphere, rotating it somehow. Let's see how this goes. First up, I did a bit of file setup. I don't need a light, so I can delete that. I wanted my camera to look at my scene straight on from the front, and I also wanted to make it a vertical scene. Next up, in the Geometry Nodes workspace, I added my first Geometry Node setup, just to prepare the grid that I'll be using for my flat star map. And already here, I had to do my first Google search to figure out which geometry node could rotate an object. Turns out it's the transform geometry node. We're learning. So I made my grid upright facing my camera, and I cleaned up my node setup a bit. With that set up, I went into render view mode since I'll be using the glow grease pencil effect. I've created a new collection, and each of my stars will be in their own grease pencil object within this collection. So I add a new grease pencil blank object and then move it to the side. Then in draw mode, with the pencil brush and a random vertex color, I drew the simplest star in the world. I had to turn off lights for this layer to see it, and I also increased its strength in sculpt mode. Then I added a glow effect. I tested out different settings, but ended up just using color mode with a regular blend mode. To get a nice glow, I combined 3 glow effects with different sizes, so that there's a more intense glow in the middle and it fades out. I played around with the color of these different effects. And for my next star, I duplicated this object, deleted the stroke in edit mode, and drew a new star with the pen brush this time, because I wanted the point to be as opaque as it could be. I'm going for different colored stars, and so I'm using different vertex colors and then modifying the colors of the glow effects to match. And then 2 more stars were added by just duplicating, recoloring the star in vertex paint mode, and changing the effect colors. I also modified a bit the sizes of the different glow effects and the stars. So with it set up and looking nice at this point, I went into material preview mode, which would get rid of the glow effect and just make things run faster. So next, I wanted to set up different opacity animations so the stars flicker in and out. I did that with a layer opacity. I keyframed it at either 1 or 0, and then I placed these keyframes along my timeline so that the stars would fade in and out. To get this to repeat, I switched to the graph editor so that I could add a cyclic modifier to my timeline. And now we can see the graph that represents the star opacities as they fade in and out. I animated the other stars next. I tried to vary things like how quickly they faded in and out, how often they flickered, to make sure that there would be lots of variation in my animation. This is something that can be tweaked later. This is just to get an idea of how everything will look. And now, with this setup, it is time to set up the geometry nodes. I thought this would be so simple. I've done instances on points before, and I know how to add a collection to my scene and to use the objects from that collection as my instances. Or at least I thought I did. I did check on these 2 boxes in the collection info node, which is important. But even so, every point that was getting created was just the same star. So after a lot of puzzling, what I realized is that actually every single star was showing up at every point, rather than what I want, which is 1 random star being picked for each point. And that's because I need to check on this box for pick instance. Now it is working beautifully. That being said, one puzzle that is still puzzling me, so the 3D viewport in the Geometry Nodes workspace, it's not showing the same grease pencil colors as the 3D viewport in like just the general layout workspace here. And this was the same for every grease pencil object, even when I added my 2D artwork. If anyone has any idea what's up with this, please let me know. I'd be very grateful. Next up, to scatter these stars more randomly along my grid, I added the Distribute Points on Faces node. So the distribution is not based on vertex count of the grid, like was my initial instinct, like I tried, but it's based on the size of the grid. So basically I could increase the amount of stars by increasing the density value of this node. So this is looking really cool. It desperately needs more randomization, but that will come later on with more stars. And at this point, I changed my background world color because I just don't enjoy having a black background. And my file is getting super laggy here. So I hid 2 of the 3 glow effects for each grease pencil object, and that helped. Honestly, a stack of 3 effects for each star was maybe a bit much. Alright, so for our first step, I am really proud of this. So for this next step, I've moved some stuff around and added a sphere. And then I just want to make sure, I guess, that the stars can also flicker onto the sphere, which they can. So then, okay, so the mess that is this node tree represents the confusion that I felt. My ambitions surpassed my current abilities, and that's okay. As I'll share later in this video, I did find a way to achieve my vision even at my current limited skill level, which is amazing. But here I just needed a Geometry Nodes palette cleanser, so I decided to switch to painting for a little while. I had the urge to use graph paper as my paper texture background for this piece. So in Krita, I modified this image that I found online and then put it as my background image. I do this in the World Properties tab. Just change the color to image texture, open up your image, and change the vector to window. Now your paper texture fills your camera view. Also, I'm working in a new blend file for this part, and then once the art is complete, I'll add the grease pencil object into my file with the geometry nodes. Originally, I had a specific idea for how I wanted the 2 scenes of this piece to look, but that plan changed based on the reference images that I found, by which I mean I could not find a reference image to match my initial idea. Honestly, I try and embrace the reference image hunt as a part of my process in itself. I use sites where users post photos with the purpose of them being used as reference images, and I have to sift through a lot of images until I find something that gives me like the feeling that I was looking for. Sometimes, like in the case of this first image, it's not the pose that I had in mind, but sometimes that's not a bad thing. I actually like this new version more. My original plan involved the child version holding up a paper that would feature the animated star map, while the adult version would be working on a laptop that projected their star map into the air. But I think this new version, it ties in both drawings together more nicely. Now the star map is like a representation of what both of them are looking at. I also like that now both of the characters are active. She is actively working on her star map. So with the art finished, I want to finalize the page setup, and this is going to revolve heavily around the center watercolor texture. I'm looking to add a bluish black paintbrush stroke, which is going to be the mask in which the star map will appear. So I added this on a new layer, and I used grease pencil film materials to add these textures. I tested out different texture options. They're all different sizes and of different opacities, and in the end, I just like this one best. I combined its original blue color with a blend value so that the vertex colors would affect these strokes, though it's a low blend value, so for the most part they are still the original blue color of the texture. I also played around with different layers, different layer blend modes, how these layers were layered on top of one another, until I got this. And then on a new layer, I used a solid fill material to fill in the parts of my sketches that are on top of my watercolor texture. And then by turning this material into a holdout material, it now hides the watercolor texture in these parts of the piece. So my layer stack goes sketch at the top, then this holdout fill to make everything underneath transparent, and then the watercolor textures. All right, with this page layout looking good, I just added a bit of text for the story. The next step now is to start animating using grease pencil modifiers, because that's something that really excites me about geometry nodes, getting to combine it with all of the grease pencil tools and techniques that I love. My plan is to animate constellations getting drawn in using the grease pencil build modifier. In planning for this, I had to figure out how I would control the speed of the animation. I have two separate elements that will be animated, a dotted star line and also 5 pointed stars in between the lines. I wanted the lines to draw in slowly, but to have the stars appear as quickly as possible. But when I just draw all of these strokes, the build modifier will have them appear all at the same speed because it's based on point count. So that point count is what I'm going to have to control to modify the speed of my build modifier. What I did is I created two grease pencil materials, one for the lines and one for the stars. The idea is to draw the lines and stars with the correct material. I can switch between the materials in draw mode with the shortcut U, though I may have already forgotten to do this. In which case I can also assign materials by selecting strokes in edit mode, and then assigning materials. You can assign materials here in the right click menu, but I definitely made sure to draw them in the right order as I want them to appear in. So line, then star, then line, then star, etc. Then, after my build modifier is added, I have it influence only my star lines layer, and then I can use simplify modifiers to control the geometry of my strokes and thus their speed. To have the stars appear quickly, I want to make their point count as small as possible. I've used a simplify modifier with adaptive mode, and I've made the factor as large as I could, resulting in the smallest number of points, while still having the stars show up with their 5 distinct points. I had this modifier affect only the material for the stars. The goal for the lines, on the other hand, is to have them draw in more slowly. So I can use another simplify modifier, have it affect my lines material, and use the sample mode. In edit mode, you can see the points that are appearing. This is a case of testing out different lengths for these points to see how it affects the speed until I found something that I liked. Important to note, the build modifier has to be placed at the bottom after these simplify modifiers to have them affect the speed of the build animation. Another benefit of this modifier with the sample mode is that the points are all equally spaced apart, meaning that the drawing speed of these lines will be consistent all the way through. Then I used a dot dash modifier to turn the lines into dotted lines, and I love it. For the final version, I made sure to switch materials while I drew, and I also used the line tool in draw mode to make the dotted lines straight. And this was my process to make this full constellation map. I really like the result. And finally, I added a noise modifier just to have a bit of flickering for the star lines. And the constellations are finished. Even though I'm trying to learn geometry nodes, I am still in love with 2D grease pencil painting, so this artwork also includes a good time spent doing that. I just love starting from a base of smooth color transitions and soft blending, which is what I'm able to get when I create pixel canvases with grease pencil. My method for doing this is still evolving. So for this piece, I used the image editor within Blender to create a 400 by 400 pixel image, and then in this dropdown, I press on Generate Grease Pencil. In object mode, I select my original grease pencil object, then shift select the new object that got created, and in this dropdown in the layers, I can copy layer 2 selected. Then I delete the new object, and in edit mode, I can resize and move around this square canvas. I made these squares purposely too large for my drawings, and then I cropped them to the right size by selecting the vertices around each drawing and deleting those points. I would go a bit past my sketch lines, and then with the strength brush in sculpt mode, I made the edges of my pixel canvas transparent. I won't go on too long about this because I am already exploring an even newer method, which looks really promising. So I'll definitely be sharing more about this in the future. This is just how my method looked like when I made this piece. Here, I'm using Vertex Paint Mode to recolor this base using the Paint tool. I like the final result, but in retrospect, I wish I had done this a bit differently. For my characters, I started from a base which was a saturated aqua blue and then painted into that. I love this idea of starting from a color because that color will often bleed through even into the final piece and kind of tint all of the later colors with that starting color. I just wish I'd been a bit more intentional about what that starting color was. I start playing around with a hue saturation modifier to try and modify first the color of my characters and then of the watercolor texture. Basically, I realized that I had picked two blues that didn't go super well together, at least in my opinion. I wish I had started from a more navy blue base for my characters, rather than the almost teal color I chose. So I ended up using the modifier to add a bit of a teal tone to the watercolor texture to help it match with the color of my character art. And like I said, I'm happy with what I ended up with, though I do think it could have been better and easier to do with a bit better planning. For this piece, I spent most of my rendering time on my sketch layer, painting on top of my sketch lines with a pencil brush, just refining everything. I made sure to duplicate my sketch layer first so that I could keep the original in case I needed to go back to it. This ended up being very helpful. I recommend doing this, or at least saving previous file versions from before you start rendering. Sometimes I would also go back to my original pixel canvas layer and continue to modify the base colors of my piece. So at this point, the artwork was looking like this. Not finished, but it was finalized enough that I wanted to start combining the two portions of my piece. So my art, like the 2D painting part, was made in a separate file, and my plan is to append my grease pencil object into my scene with the geometry nodes. Honestly, maybe my camera too. I think I like my camera setup where it is, so I'll probably keep that as well. And then when I have an updated version of the art later on, I can append that and just have it take the place of my first grease pencil object. I added the same background texture, had to turn on this box in the material preview mode dropdown to see it, and I changed the color management to standard. And then guess whose laptop couldn't handle their blend file? Mine. It's fine. I know it's because of all the glow effects. Like, I rarely use lights or grease pencil effects when I work. I don't really want to in most cases. This piece was a bit of an exception. Luckily, also, my boyfriend has a very beefy gaming computer, so I used that to finish this piece. This was my finalizing checklist in no particular order. So here's what my final node tree looks like. The only big change is that I added a random value node to randomize both the rotation and scale of my instances. It didn't make a huge difference, but now my stars are slightly different sizes and rotations, the rotation being mostly for these stars, which are kind of oval shaped. And so my plan originally was to have a flat star map that would turn into a rotating 3D spherical star map. And I thought I'd be able to do this with a flat grid that would turn into a sphere. Maybe there's a way to do that. I certainly couldn't figure it out. Instead, I just have the sphere. And so at the start of the animation, when it's not moving, I realized there's nothing that gives away the fact that it's not technically flat. So I have this sphere object in my scene, and I transformed it to the location where I wanted it to be, also gave it the correct scale. So I could add this object as a node just by dragging it into my node tree setup. I used it for both the mesh base of my star map, that's this here, and also I had my star map match the location, rotation, and scale of my sphere. I did that with a transform geometry node, just plugging in all the values from my sphere object into there. So it's actually this sphere object that I animated, and the geometry nodes just copy that animation. And it's that animation, the sphere shrinking down and starting to rotate, which reveals the true spherical nature of the flickering stars. For the flickering stars, I made 2 copies of each star, and I moved around their keyframes, mostly so that they wouldn't all line up with one another, and there would be more variety. And I also made some of the flickering animations slower. I thought that I would need to do something more complex to hide the back of my star map, so both the flickering stars and my 3D constellations. But turns out just being behind the watercolor texture of my grease pencil object with my 2D paintings, that was enough to hide them. Though I did have to change the stroke depth order to 3D for some of these objects. Speaking of my 3D constellations, isn't this so cool? This is in its own grease pencil object with the same materials and modifiers as for my 2D constellations. And drawing this was as simple as I could have hoped for. I did the exact same process, only now I drew with grease pencil stroke placement on surface with a small offset. I could even use my line tool. I wasn't sure if that would work, delightfully surprised that it did. I didn't have to move these elements much, but to do so, I could place the 3D cursor at the center of my sphere object. And then back in edit mode of my grease pencil object, I could use the 3D cursor as a pivot point to rotate around that, which allowed me to move my constellations. So it was my sphere object that I used as a surface on which to draw, and I also parented the grease pencil object to the sphere so that it would rotate along with the sphere and the flickering stars. And the final thing was to animate the 2D artworks to either draw in or draw out so that the piece could transition between the 2 versions of this character. I did this on a new layer. I just drew strokes covering the art entirely, and I used 2 build modifiers to have these strokes draw in, then out. At first I tried having just one single stroke, was not a big fan. I wanted to have one artwork be drawn out at the same time as the other one was being drawn in. So I used 2 different strokes for this. And so within the build modifier, I wanted to change the mode from sequential to concurrent so that they draw in/out at the same time. So I lowered the opacity of this layer with the strokes to 0. And then I used layer masking to mask one of the drawings to this layer. And I invert masked the other drawing to this layer. The 2 drawings I should mention are on separate layers at this point. So the drawing that's masked will show up when the stroke is on screen, getting drawn in with the build modifier. And the drawing that is inverse masked will only show up when there's no stroke. So this gets drawn out when the stroke appears. And vice versa for the build modifier, the second build modifier, which has the stroke, disappear from my scene. I hope I explained that well. You can always check out my final blend file if you want to see this more closely. It is free to download, and it has everything, not just this build modifier setup, but like everything I talked about in this video. And that is indeed everything. Oh my gosh, this was a lot of fun. Thanks for watching. Stay tuned for more adventures into geometry nodes. Exciting. If you're interested in seeing my videos early and also longer version of my tutorials, including my process in real time, Patreon may be something that you might check out. But I appreciate you being here no matter what, and I will see you very soon. Take care. Bye.